Back to that breaking news. The Supreme Court just issued an order on President Trump's ballroom. Joining us, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin, James Sample, Vaughn Hilliard, and Scott MacFarlane are all still with us. Lisa, what has the court said?
Well, if you wanted a very detailed explanation from the court about what it was going to do about the ballroom, we did not get it. Instead, we got a one-paragraph order from the Chief Justice of the court saying only that the preliminary injunction that had been entered in April that would prevent the president from building above ground is stayed. And this is the key language, pending further order of the undersigned or of the court. What the Chief Justice is doing here is issuing what's called an administrative stay. It is a decision that is designed to prolong the status quo for a short period of time. So if someone is trying to read into this, is this the court putting its thumb on the scale as an entire court making a decision on the merits? It is not. It is just John Roberts in his capacity as what's called the circuit justice, the justice responsible for overseeing the federal appeals court in D.C., saying we're pressing pause. We're allowing the status quo to continue while we as a full court make a decision.
Do you agree with MS Now Chief Justice Lisa Rubin?
I, as an associate justice of the Chief Justice, I would go.
I like the promotion.
A concurring opinion on everything Lisa just said.
Okay, so if it's an administrative stay, just a few days now, we have to wait likely for a decision?
Well, a few days likely, right? The Chief Justice is not telling us when he or the full court will make a decision. So let's talk about the practical impact of this. Donald Trump can continue to do what he has said in his tweet or Truth Social post today that he would do, which is continue to build the ballroom. And as we know from the New York Times and others, he is continuing to build that ballroom with a staff of hundreds, with the kinds of materials that we would not expect in a construction project proceeding on an ordinary pace.
So I have so many questions about the legality of this, and then also turning the White House into a military complex. First, so the legality. On what grounds could you anticipate the Supreme Court ruling for the president? Let's play that exercise first.
Sure. The argument that the administration has made and will make, and would be the argument that the court would adopt if they were to rule in that way, would be that the balance of the equities, now that the ballroom is at whatever percentage of completion it is, favors continuing with the project.
So it worked to ask to do it and then ask forgiveness later?
This is the classic scenario. In fact, in the last segment, we were just discussing the problem that the courts sometimes can't keep up with the executive branch, right? This is do first and get permission later.
Yeah.
And it might actually be successful. That will be the basis of the administration's argument.
If they rule against Donald Trump, what would they base it on, potentially?
The law. They would base it on the law, which is to say that this has been unlawful based on the letter of the law all along, but the law is just parchment. It is just words on paper if the
letter
executive
says
doesn't come.
Congress has to approve this. All right, so where's Congress, Scott?
Well, Congress is the one that has to authorize this. They haven't. That's been part of the issue. But there's another layer to this, to add on to what James and Lisa said. In asking the Supreme Court to intervene, the Trump administration said they have to keep working on this project beyond 11:59 p.m. tonight, the cutoff time, because it was, quote, critical for ensuring the White House can serve as a secure location for the president. That, to me, still seems contorted because the district court judge, whose order has just been stayed, said they can keep doing the below ground work. They could keep doing the security work. What's been halted is the above ground work on things that involve marble and a ballroom. So the Trump administration seems to have had its cake and eaten it too here. They made a security argument, which was kind of baseless because the judge didn't stop the security work, but they still secured the Chief Justice's ruling today. This can continue past midnight and really indefinitely till there's a further argument.
Chief Justice Rubin?
I would say that the Trump administration's national security argument is itself evolving because Scott is right. First, they said that it was the below ground work that was really critical to national security. But lately, they have submitted a number of declarations from cabinet officials that have said even the ballroom itself is a matter of national security. Because, for example, how could the president host a state dinner with heads of state from multiple places around the country? How could he host a meeting without ensuring that there is an adequately safe place for them to be on the White House complex? That is sort of the enlargement and morphing of their security argument that they are now trying to put.
Well, has the safety of the White House complex materially changed?
Those are what Lisa just described, and this is not disagreeing with Lisa Qualisa. Those are arguments that would be phenomenally...
I love your legal jokes between the two of you. It's very
Those
cute.
are arguments that would have a place on the floor of Congress. Those are policy arguments that could have been made if you were trying to do this through the proper channels. They're not after-the-fact justifications for ignoring the law.
Vaughn, I want to bring you in on this. The White House, listen, there's always been the Situation Room. There's always been a bunker. Donald Trump was in it when he was nervous about protests at the White House and in Washington, D.C. at the end of his last term. But this is something different. Explain the change as you've been able to witness it.
And also to add to that, he's also been posting images, AI images of a drone port on top of the ballroom. And Lisa's point about the ever-evolving national security threat that the Trump administration is using to justify the construction of the ballroom entity itself. Forget the chairs and the gold paint inside. But I think that is where you're looking at the way in which we covered so closely in 2022, 2023, 2024, how the Trump legal team effectively was able to stall the justice system and figure out a way in order to run out the clock so effectively. And now we saw them tear down the East Wing efficiently before the courts could intervene. We're seeing them move at a chaotic pace in order to get this up. And part of their filing, too, was the idea that there's now a 70-foot structure and beams that are potentially hazardous and that they are unstable, and that if they were left in disrepair there, that they would pose a threat to the White House grounds. And I think that is where it gets to your question, Katie, here, is about the way in which Donald Trump has used these construction projects as an extension of the threats that he claims are being posed against him. It was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner redo a couple weeks ago where he went off on a whole tangent about the idea of the drone port on top of the ballroom. And let's be clear, there are security threats. There are threats against the president's life, but he is using the installment of the security apparatus, including, even if you look at the fencing around Lafayette Park that they have put up. Lafayette Park is not open to the public right now, and they are putting forward proposals to build up permanent fencing around there. And the justification is for safety purposes, but I think that causes a lot of concern as to what extent can Donald Trump and his team justify national security and safety concerns to get their way with all of these other arguments they're making on a variety of issues.
Yeah, and Scott, at what point does the People's House fully stop becoming the People's House and become a bunker, a safe house, something that is inaccessible to the public, something that we can't even see any longer? As Vaughn was talking about Lafayette Park, you can't get close to the place anymore without a huge security apparatus to make it through. I mean, was this, I'm going to make you put on a presidential historian hat here, was this the intention of the White House to make it a singular and secure space that the president could wrap himself in?
Oh, it's a glorious moment for the husband of an AP U.S. history teacher, Katie. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, good. I knew it.
The East Wing was expanded early in the 1900s and then again in the mid-1900s, not under a security paradigm, but to make a more suitable space for the White House, largely. But I'm wondering about the politics here. I can't think of a Democratic candidate out there who isn't joyful seeing this ballroom remain a fixation of Trump's, as there's dwindling days till an election, and this is about as popular as chicken pox to the public, which can't afford college, health care, food, and fuel. That they're spending $400 million on this hole in the ground is political malpractice for the Republicans.
Please do say hi to your wife for us. AP U.S. history was my absolute favorite subject in high school. So hats off to her and to you for being smart enough to marry her. Lisa, jump in. What do you want to say?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about how the Trump administration is sort of using the threats against the president across lots of its legal proceedings right now. So let's talk about the case against Jim Comey, where in a brief, in response to his motion to dismiss that indictment, they talk about the various plots against the president. And I want to quote from it because this is a theme for them across various things that they're trying to do. They say the threat environment for the president is currently the worst our nation has ever seen. In the past 2 years alone, at least 17 individuals have attempted to kill President Trump. So it's not just in the context of the ballroom that they are using the threats against the president and trying to use them to win their way. They are doing so across a variety of matters, whether it is the Seychelles case against Jim Comey or to try and justify the vanity project that Donald Trump wants built at the White House. The national security argument for them and their concept of his enlarged constitutional powers to address those national security issues, Katie, that looms large over everything that the Department of Justice is doing right now, no matter the subject.
There's just a discomfort I have with seeing it turned into a bunker. It just seems like something better suited for the Pentagon, for a military complex, not for the White House, understanding, obviously, the complex threat environment against this particular president, but against national security in general. The world is changing very, very quickly, and there are lots of scary things going on. But at the same time, what makes our democracy is our ability to see and sometimes touch, get close enough to really access the halls of power and the seat of power in this country, and to see it turned into a barricaded bunker gives me discomfort, certainly. Coming up, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.